Imagine this. A young black man, dressed casually, is driving through an upscale neighborhood, minding his own business. But suddenly, the flashing lights of a police car appear in his rearview mirror. What happens next might shock you. The officers chase him down, aggressively questioning his presence in the area, accusing him of being out of place. The tension rises as he tries to explain himself, but the officers refuse to listen, determined to make him feel like an outsider. But here's a twist. As the chase intensifies, the officers have no idea who they're actually pursuing. They're so focused on their assumptions that they fail to recognize who the man truly is. What unfolds next will leave you speechless. The truth behind why he was targeted is something no one expected, especially not the officers who were so quick to judge. What happened when the officers finally discovered his true identity? Was this all just a case of racial profiling, or was there something deeper at play? Stay tuned to find out how this encounter unfolds and the unexpected twist that leaves everyone in shock. You won't want to miss what happens next. The young man, named Jamal, had just finished a meeting in the city. He wasn't a troublemaker. In fact, he had spent years building a successful career, one that was far from what the officers might have imagined. As he drove through the peaceful, tree-lined streets of his upscale neighborhood, he couldn't help but notice how calm everything seemed, a stark contrast to the chaos that was about to unfold. Jamal had always been cautious, aware of the world's biases and how people could judge him based on his skin color alone. He wasn't the type to draw attention to himself, but in that moment, he found himself being singled out for no other reason than the color of his skin. The police car followed him closely, its lights flashing in his mirrors, creating a sense of unease he couldn't shake off. He slowed down, hoping to make sense of what was happening. Was it a case of mistaken identity? Was he being targeted simply because he didn't fit the image of someone who would belong in that neighborhood? He pulled over, the nerves in his stomach tightening as the officers approached. The officer who spoke first was quick to accuse him, questioning why he was there and demanding his ID. Jamal tried to stay calm, his heart racing, but his mind was racing too. What was this all really about? As Jamal handed over his ID, the officer's eyes scanned it with a sense of suspicion. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, each second feeling like an eternity. He tried to stay composed, but the officer's body language was anything but reassuring. The officer's partner, a woman with sharp eyes, stood by the car, watching him closely. Jamal felt the weight of their gaze, as if they were trying to dissect him, figure out what he was doing there. Why did it feel like they already had him guilty of something? The officer glanced at Jamal's ID, his eyes narrowing. "So, you're telling me you live here?" he asked, his voice flat. Jamal nodded, his mind racing. Of course, he lived there. He had bought the house a year ago. But something about the officer's tone made it clear that wasn't enough. It didn't matter that Jamal had every right to be there. He was being treated like an intruder, someone who didn't belong in a place like this. As the officers continued to question him, Jamal felt a deep frustration building inside him. Was this how it felt to be treated like a suspect just because of his skin color? He couldn't help but think about the countless stories he'd heard about people who had been wrongfully accused or harassed. Was this his story now? Meanwhile, across the street, a neighbor stood in her front yard, watching the whole scene unfold. She had seen Jamal move in a few months ago, and while she hadn't spoken to him much, she had always thought he seemed like a polite, hard-working guy. But now, as she watched the police surround his car, she couldn't help but feel uneasy. Why were they treating him like this? It didn't sit right with her, but she stayed quiet, unsure of what to do. The tension was palpable. There was something about this moment that didn't feel like it was just about Jamal. It felt like it was about something bigger, something systemic that was playing out in real time. Jamal's mind raced as the officers continued their questioning. He could feel the frustration building, but he wasn't about to let them provoke him into doing something he'd regret. He tried to explain, tried to reason with them, but the officer wasn't listening. His body language grew more aggressive with each passing second. What was it that had triggered this? Was it simply a case of racial profiling, or was there more to it? Why was Jamal being singled out, and what was going to happen next? The answers felt just out of reach, like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. And Jamal was about to find out just how dangerous it could be to not fit the image of what someone expected. Jamal could feel the officer's gaze bore into him as the questions grew more personal. Where did he work? What was he doing here, in a neighborhood like this? The words were sharp, like daggers thrown to provoke, and it didn't take long before Jamal realized this wasn't a simple traffic stop. This was something else, something much darker. He had lived in the neighborhood long enough to know how the others looked at him, but never had it felt this direct, this confrontational. The officer's tone had a certain edge, one that didn't sit well with Jamal. It was clear he wasn't just being asked for his ID. He was being judged, treated like a suspect for no reason other than the color of his skin. Jamal's mind raced, fighting back the rising anger. He could feel the heat of frustration rising in his chest, but he kept it in check. He knew this could escalate quickly if he made one wrong move. The tension was suffocating, and it seemed like everything around him had frozen. The distant hum of the city felt far away as he stood there, trying to navigate this impossible situation. But then something shifted. The officer who had been questioning him took a few steps back, his eyes darting between Jamal and his partner. It was as if something had caught his attention. Jamal didn't know what it was, but in that split second, a flicker of doubt crossed the officer's face. The woman, still standing off to the side, seemed to tense up as well, her hand subtly brushing the radio on her belt. Jamal's pulse quickened. Was this the moment they'd finally realized their mistake? Across the street, the neighbor who had been watching from her yard was now moving closer, her steps cautious but deliberate. She had been quietly observing the whole exchange, and as she got closer, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. She recognized Jamal's name from the neighborhood's residents list. She had seen him at community meetings, shaking hands with the mayor and the local business owners. He wasn't just some random person driving through. He was a part of this community. Yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. Her heart raced. She knew something wasn't right, but she didn't know how to intervene without making the situation worse. Jamal glanced back at the officers, noticing the subtle shift in their behavior. Were they starting to realize their mistake? Or was this just the calm before the storm? The weight of the moment was suffocating, the silence unbearable. Everything hung in the balance as Jamal stood there, trying to maintain his composure, waiting for the next move. What would they do? What would happen if they didn't back down? In the back of his mind, Jamal couldn't help but wonder how far they would take this. Would they let him go, or was something more sinister at play? And why did he feel like they were holding back the truth, just out of reach? The tension was unbearable, and Jamal's instincts told him that whatever came next would change everything. Just as Jamal began to sense the officers might finally back off, something unexpected happened. The woman officer, who had been silent for a while, suddenly turned her attention toward the radio on her belt. Her fingers hovered over the button, but she hesitated. Then, without warning, she lifted the radio to her mouth, muttering something too quiet for Jamal to hear. He felt the tension shift, like a storm brewing just overhead. The next few seconds felt like hours. The air was thick with uncertainty, and Jamal's gut told him something wasn't right. He knew they weren't just about to let him go. His heart began to race again, and his mind was working overtime, piecing together what had just happened. Was she calling for backup? Were they preparing to arrest him? He didn't have time to think it through. He only knew that the situation was getting more dangerous with every passing second. Then, as the woman officer lowered the radio, she exchanged a look with her partner. Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding Jamal couldn't quite grasp. It was the kind of look that suggested they had something on him, something they were about to reveal. And just when Jamal thought the moment couldn't get more intense, a black SUV appeared down the street, turning the corner into the neighborhood. It wasn't just any vehicle. Jamal's breath caught when he recognized the driver. It was Marcus, one of his closest friends, the man who had helped him move into the neighborhood. The SUV stopped just behind the police car. Marcus stepped out, his face a mix of confusion and concern. Jamal's heart sank. Why was Marcus here? And why did it feel like his presence was making everything worse? The officers now turned their attention to Marcus, who walked cautiously toward them. Jamal couldn't hear their conversation, but the tension was palpable. He watched his friend's face tighten as the officers spoke to him. What were they accusing Marcus of? What was really happening here? Suddenly, Jamal realized what was going on. The officers weren't just harassing him. They had been looking for someone else, someone who had been involved in something much bigger. The suspicion on Jamal had been misplaced, but the officers weren't willing to let go of their assumptions. They'd clearly mistaken him for someone else. Marcus's appearance only confirmed it. But why had they singled out this neighborhood in the first place? What did they really think was going on here? Jamal's stomach twisted as he realized that this was bigger than just a case of mistaken identity. There was a much larger web of confusion and suspicion surrounding the officers' actions. And now, with Marcus involved, things were about to take an even darker turn. The stakes had just been raised, and Jamal knew they were only getting started. The tension in the air was unbearable as Marcus stood in front of the officers, his hands slightly raised in a peaceful gesture. Jamal watched from his car, his mind racing. What was going on? Was Marcus being pulled into this mess too? The officers seemed to be questioning him in an even more aggressive manner now, and Jamal's gut told him they were on the verge of making a terrible mistake. That's when the woman officer suddenly turned back to Jamal, her voice sharp as she spoke. "Is this your friend?" she asked, her eyes scanning Marcus as if trying to connect the dots. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. "Yes, that's Marcus. He's—" Before he could finish, the officer cut him off. "We've been tracking a suspect, someone connected to several break-ins in the area. Your friend fits the description we were given." Jamal's breath caught in his chest. He couldn't believe it. Was this really happening? They were accusing Marcus of being involved in a crime, someone Jamal trusted like family. The officer turned back to Marcus, now looking at him with a mix of suspicion and authority. Jamal could see the worry on his friend's face, the confusion. It wasn't just about Jamal anymore. They had dragged Marcus into the mess too. But just as the officer reached for her radio again, the unexpected happened. The neighbor who had been watching from the yard, the one who had been quietly observing the whole ordeal, stepped forward. Her voice was calm but firm as she called out, "Excuse me, officer." The officers turned in her direction and she continued, "I live here. I've seen both of these men. Marcus is a local business owner. He's been a part of the community for years. Jamal here, he's been in this neighborhood long enough to know he doesn't belong in any kind of crime scene. This is a mistake." The woman officer hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the neighbor's sudden intervention. She glanced at her partner, whose face was unreadable. The radio crackled in the background, but the words were muffled. For a moment, it felt like time had frozen. The silence was deafening, the weight of the misunderstanding hanging thick in the air. And then, as if the universe decided to throw in one last twist, a black sedan pulled up to the scene. Another officer stepped out of the vehicle, this time a senior officer with a stern expression. He walked over to the officers questioning Jamal and Marcus, and in an instant, everything changed. The senior officer held out his hand, as if to stop the situation from escalating further. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes scanning the group. The officer who had been interrogating Marcus looked flustered. "Sir, we've got a suspect. We thought it was him."